Okay, we got Dr. Jamie Slaughter doing his fifth of maybe 7 or 8 presentations. I don't know when he's going to stop. I think he keeps adding to them as he goes along. But we'll let him take the screen and take the stage here. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. And yeah, I think we're going to extend at least one more because in the process of looking at this over the last 2 weeks, one of the things that continues to fascinate people about Antietam is the number of casualties. So I think the last video or the next to last video I really want to do is actually analyzing the casualties of Antietam. And I thought it'd be kind of nice to do one video just on that and kind of bring all of this back in focus toward the end to kind of pinpoint where the bulk of the casualties are occurring during the course of the day. And to the extent that I can, and I'm not convinced I can do it completely at what time they're occurring. If I can do that. Now I think I can do it to a point, but I don't think I can do it completely. But it'll be an interesting trip to see if it'll work, and I'm kind of looking forward to that one. So let me get my.
I hope you do justice to the Texas Brigade.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, we'll do that. So, all right. Back a second, just a minute. What I've done wrong with that? That's weird. Never done that. Oh wait, cancel. I am not certain what I did. That's a little odd.
You want to hit the button that goes to full screen.
There we go.
Yeah.
Not quite certain how we ended up way back there, but all right, here we go. Sorry about that. So tonight's presentation is on Burnside's Bridge. One of the more interesting aspects of Antietam, and really probably because it's still there, really the most visible remnant of the battle, maybe other than Dunker Church, which has of course been rebuilt, but it's one of the key points in the battle and one of the parts that attracts more people to it than any other. And again, there's been some really good scholarship over the past few years that have really kind of changed the perspective on the battle here, what it means, why it happened the way it did, and what its role is in the context of the rest of the Battle of Antietam. So one thing that I think it's important to understand about this battle, and particularly about Burnside's Bridge, which was at the time known as Lower Bridge, it's been named Burnside's Bridge after the war, is that if you look at the topography of the battlefield as a whole, Antietam Creek forms a notable water barrier on the eastern side of the battlefield. And past Antietam Creek to the east, you've got South Mountain, which is where about half of Lee's army and most of the Army of Potomac had just come from a few days prior to the Battle of Antietam. Now, the other thing about Burnside's Bridge is this, that on that on that east bank of the creek, all the way up the east bank of the creek, there was a fairly good road that ran along the side of the creek, and it was well maintained. It had been used for trade and transportation before the war, and it sat on the floodplain from Antietam Creek. So it was a nice flat road. And it ran not quite perfectly north and south, but more or less north and south. And that side of the creek actually provides a really good way to transport, theoretically, a large number of men up and down that creek. Now, a little bit about the creek. It's usually slow flowing, and it was flowing rather slow in the day of the battle. If you've ever been there, honestly, it looks still for the most part. It's a very gentle creek. It doesn't have a lot of slope to it. It's less than 30 yards across at Lower Bridge. Um, and it's a relatively shallow creek, and it can be crossed on foot in many, if not most places. And a long time ago, when I was a lot younger, you could go into the creek by Burnside's Bridge. And the reason that you can't really now, if you see this tree here, this is a witness tree, and the fence blocks off access to the creek here. You go further down on either side and you can. But at most points of that creek, and it's not really any deeper, it's not really any shallower than at the Battle. There's a lot of places you can walk right across it, no higher than chest height or waist high. And again, it's not much of a barrier really for an individual, but getting a lot of people across it is a different story. So it does provide something of a barrier, at least a hindrance to transportation. And that road on the far side of it, and the far side of the creek is actually over here next to this tree, is an excellent way to move, again, a large number of people pretty quickly.
Hey guys,
I read.
what's up?
Oh, just getting started.
Yeah,
So
are you Mercedes? Mercedes, let's get a picture of you since you're so beautiful today. 35 years of marriage, I know what to say, don't I?
So let me keep going on this, Reed, and just so um
There we go, perfect.
um so the far side of the creek actually
Good to go. Are you working out, sir? And you've been there before?
Reed, can you mute your mic? And that far side of the creek potentially represents a serious threat to McClellan's left flank and the rear of the Army of the Potomac, because most of the Army of the Potomac is actually on the west bank of this creek in the morning of the battle. Now, it's not much of a barrier if you go down there and you look at it, but it still is a barrier. So again, it would slow people down. It wouldn't stop them. But that nice flat plain and that really good road makes it a possible and likely movement route. And although McClellan is concentrating on Lee's left flank, that still is a possibility. And that road connects with other roads that are coming up from the Harper's Ferry area. So McClellan is cognizant of the fact that area has to be defended. And what he does is he sends the Ninth Corps under Burnside to that area in the beginning to act really more as a blocking force than anything. Now, again, most of McClellan's forces are on the west bank of the creek by mid-morning. And that route is a very inviting route for an attack, especially on a north-south line. And Lee still has a large number of troops down in the Harper's Ferry area. So again, this is a key point. McClellan wants to make sure he controls this area. And that's really his idea in the morning. And I'm going to tell you why. Again, his idea changes and what he wants to do here changes as the battle starts to develop. Because in the beginning, realistically, Burnside was sent there just to make sure that Lee or parts of Lee's army don't try to get around on McClellan's left while he's concentrating on trying to smash Lee's right flank around the Cornfield, Dunker Church, and the West Woods. So again, kind of kudos here to McClellan because he sees this. Okay, McClellan is a general that's undergone, several permutations and several different versions of whether he's a good general or bad general. But realistically, I think some of the newer evaluations of him are more fair than they used to be. And he knows this is an area that he's going to have to control. A little bit about Burnside. Burnside is going to fight for most of the war, actually pretty much all the way through to the end. He's a successful engineer, bright man. Designs the Burnside carbine. If you didn't know what that was in use all through the war. And I think by the end of the war, it was on the 6th modification or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. Relatively successful general if you look at him through the course of the war. If you take his actions as a whole and not, we don't concentrate strictly on things like Fredericksburg. He's got another bad engagement at the crater, but he's a solid corps commander through most of the war. He's had commands in North Carolina and Virginia prior to Antietam. Again, if you're looking at his overall record, some wins, some losses, but not bad. And he does, when the Army of the Potomac really is going through corps commanders and commanders of the Army rather quickly, even though we've got the Fredericksburg fiasco just about a few months after Antietam, he still is maintained through the bulk of the war. He'd been offered command of the Army of the Potomac after Peninsula refused it. An interesting thing about Burnside is that when he does eventually take command of the Army of the Potomac before Fredericksburg after McClellan is relieved after Antietam, he really doesn't like the idea. He has a good sense of his own talents and limitations. And Burnside seemed to understand that he was good at the corps level, but he wasn't great at the Army level. And he really didn't want that promotion when he got it. Now, the reason he eventually ends up taking this, and I'll concentrate more on this next year when I do a series hopefully on Fredericksburg before we do the Fredericksburg tour conference, is that he really takes the command of the Army of the Potomac later on because of rivalries. He and Joe Hooker do not get along. There's a lot of corps commanders. There's a lot of that don't get along inside McClellan's army. A lot of division commanders that don't get along. There's a lot of backstabbing and skullduggery and so on and so forth. So, but again, he's got a pretty good idea that he's good at the corps level, but at the Army he's not. So, a smart guy, not by any means unintelligent. He just, he's working well within his means at the corps level. Now, McClellan orders 9th Corps south. Now, the Corps badge here is the later 9th Corps badge. This is from about 1864 or so. And the 9th Corps is to secure the east flank of Antietam Creek to prevent Lee from moving around the Army of the Potomac's flank. Again, to hold that land that's on the east side of the creek between Antietam Creek and South Mountain, to make sure that McClellan doesn't suffer a devastating flank attack from that open flank kind of hanging in the air while he's trying to force the matter with Lee's left flank. Now, again, Burnside's bridge is referred to as Lower Bridge. Middle Bridge, which is a bit further north, that area is secured by 5th Corps as the fighting in the morning is going to develop. And again, in the beginning, this is not a main point of effort. In the beginning, that area around Burnside's bridge and that part of Antietam Creek is strictly really a defensive move. Burnside is not sent there in the morning with the intent nor the orders to attack when he is sent out in the morning to cover that area. That's not what his role is initially. Again, Lee's left flank is the point of main effort and most of the focus of the morning action. So, for instance, around the cornfield, Dunker Church, and again, West Woods. So, when we look at this objectively and we kind of start tearing this apart, and again, this is a lot due to recent scholarship that's kind of gone back and reevaluated this. When Burnside goes there in the morning, he really doesn't have the intent to do anything except secure that flank. Now, he knows that during the course of the battle, obviously, his orders can change, and they do. But when he gets there in the morning, he doesn't have any clue that he's going to have to find a way to fight up the other side of the ridge, because when you go to Antietam Creek, if you've ever been to Burnside's bridge, you know that the east side of the creek in a lot of places is significantly lower. The land on the east side of the creek is significantly lower than the land on the west side of the creek. There's a rise there. And then if you go even further west from Antietam Creek, and you can see this in a topo sheet really well, but it's also very easy to see from the top of the hill at overlooking Burnside's bridge, there's another rise further on. And what these really look like are old floodplains. Whether they are or not, I'm not a geologist. I can't tell you, but they look look for every thing in the world, like little floodplains that are just higher and higher as you go. So as you go west out of the creek, the land rises significantly twice, really, before you get to Sharpsburg. Once on the other side of the creek, basically where the point of this battle is, and then again about a mile away, just outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, you're going to see the land rise significantly again, and it's visible with the naked eye. You don't need really to look at, it's not elevation lines in the topo sheet, and you have to sit there and argue it out. If you're sitting at the field, you can see it. Now, looking at Lee's right flank, the Army of Northern Virginia is a fraction of the size. Now, this is a fact we've established well before, but it always bears repeating. And what Lee has to do is hold to a tighter interior line until the rest of his army comes up from the Harpers Ferry area. His line is not broadly dispersed on that battlefield. If you look at that realistically, you're looking at, in most places on that battlefield, at the most about a mile apart. I mean, for instance, from Dunker Church down to the Sunken Lane, Bloody Lane, it's only about 400 yards. And you're about another 800, maybe 1,000 yards further or so from Bloody Lane down to Burnside's Bridge. So this is a pretty tight little battlefield when you look at it. Again, we talked during the cornfield talk, we're talking about 200 acres of battlefield where literally at the end of the day, you could step from corpse to corpse to corpse from one end of the battlefield to the other without touching the ground because of the concentration of dead and wounded. Again, a small battlefield. This is not like, Gettysburg is a significantly larger field than this is. Okay. This is a pretty tight little confined space. Lee's left flank is significantly stronger and it's weaker toward the right. This is, again, part and parcel due to the fact of the way the fighting develops in the morning, with the early fighting starting about 5:30 in the morning up near the cornfield in Dunker Church. And part of Lee's line being part of the forces that are available to Lee on the right actually starting to be drawn into this fight. And it's going to bring a large number of troops from other parts of the battlefield to help him hold on to that left flank. That's kind of part of the story here, too, because what Lee is going to do is withdraw some of the troops that were close to the lower bridge, Burnside's Bridge, and kind of in between the lower bridge and the middle bridge during the early morning course of the fighting. Now, defending the bridge, there are only parts of two remnants of the 2nd and 20th Georgia Infantry, about 500 men. Realistically, the number is probably a little bit closer to 400. There's a little bit of discrepancy as to how many men were there. They're under General Robert Toombs. Both of these units have seen action. They're not green units. And both of them were competent. Toombs is regarded as a fairly competent commander. Actually receives a lot of acclaim for holding this bridge as long as he did. And they're spread out at the bridge over a distance, realistically, of about 200 yards, maybe a bit over that, maybe about 300 yards, centered kind of on the bridge, but to the left and right in the vicinity overlooking the bridge. Now, the terrain itself is a really interesting thing to see, and we've kind of described this a little bit to this point, but we can go into more detail on it. The west bank of Antietam Creek overlooks the bridge at a significantly higher elevation. It's about 100 feet higher or so on the west bank than it is on the east bank. Now, if you go today and you look at it, it's been restored more to the way it was during the war. But there were clear fields of view off of that hill, down across the creek, and into that little floodplain below. So there are a few scattered trees. There weren't many trees. And if you look at it today, and I've tried to pull that out in some of these pictures, those large open areas were large open areas during the battle. Now, the hillside that the Georgians were on was not particularly heavily wooded either. So, it was a fairly open view both ways. at least in the immediate vicinity of the bridge. Now, back behind the bridge, we'll talk about the terrain a little bit more when we get to the third assault. But there is no place on this field, basically the entire area that's going to be fought over the morning to the early afternoon, the 17th, around the bridge, that is not within easy small arms range. It's within very easy small arms range, especially with rifle musket, because you're talking about a minimum effective range of about 500 yards. Most of these shots are going to be 150, 200 yards, or maybe a bit longer to 300. And again, considering that the time and tactics, you're looking at masses of men that are in open ground within relatively easy rifle shots of the defenders up on the hill. One of the things that's actually a little hard to see today, that was a little bit more pronounced at the time, is that on that hillside overlooking Burnside's bridge were quarry pits. So that hillside had been quarried out for stone by a lot of the local farmers over the past years, and there were basically pre-made rifle pits in that hillside. So the Georgians are firing from fairly good cover. And although, the pits are kind of scattered around, most of them have what amounts to a pre-made foxhole or a pre-made trench to get into to defend the bridge from. So that's a bonus for them. The bridge is obviously a bottleneck. And again, it's easy to predict if you're going to force the bridge. And there's little vegetation, again, to cover the assault. So it's not the area immediately around the bridge doesn't provide a tremendous amount of cover, especially if you're coming from the north or the south along the road. It's very open the entire way. It's easy to see what's going on there. If the approach is made on that road, there's no real surprises possible. Okay. So again, this is going to be a very tough sort of an assault to carry this bridge. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the battle at the bridge is really only part of what Burnside is trying to do. Burnside did not do good reconnaissance of the area. Now, we can argue all day long about why this particular failing happened. It can be, well, he was just sent there to block the area. Well, and then the next argument is, okay, he may have been there to hold the flank or to block that area or to stop any potential Confederate advance, but it doesn't excuse him, basically doing at least some basic reconnaissance of the area to see what's around the area that Ninth Corps is in. There were plenty of places to cross with better fording and few or no Confederates, actually a few in between Middle Bridge and the Lower Bridge, and even more south, and we'll get to that in a minute. And this is up and down the creek. So Lee's army, again, is much smaller. He doesn't have enough troops to hold a solid line up and down this creek line and still hold on to Bloody Lane, Sunken Lane, and then what's going on over in the area of the cornfield and Dunker Church. And Burnside, beginning about 9 o'clock or so in the morning, is going to receive orders that he has to attack. And why he has to attack is because Lee is starting to pull some of his troops away from the right toward the left. And what McClellan decides to do after all this has started to develop is to actually pressure Lee along his right flank too, to not let up, to make the battle harder on Lee, because he realizes he can see that Lee is pulling his forces in from all over the field to kind of hold that center and left. The other thing about the bridge is it may seem like it's obviously a bottleneck, and that's a given, but it's a lot faster to get across the bridge than it is to get across the creek. The creek's about waist high, maybe mid-chest high, depending on how tall you are, but it's still a faster jot across the bridge than it is to try to run across the creek. We'll get back to that too, because they try to do that at a point. Now, the other thing about Burnside that he sometimes isn't given full credit for is after the orders arrive to attack, he's going to send troops south. And he's moving troops down to the southern part of the creek, a place called Snavely's Ford, which he finally gets some ideas there. And what he wants to do is move a significant number of troops across Snavely's Ford, which is a lower point in the creek than even at the bridge, and kind of go around on the Confederate right flank and roll up that right flank. Because he knows that, and he can see there's not a lot of Confederate units actually in that area. The problem is getting further south to find that good fording area, to get those troops across, and how much time that's going to take, and how long is it going to take those troops who go down there to actually make that maneuver and then start to roll that flank up on Burnside's left side, but on the Confederate right. The first assault is actually going to begin shortly after 10 a.m. And this is again when McClellan finally orders Burnside to attack, because Burnside's not going to receive orders until after about 9 o'clock to conduct this attack. And the first unit into the attack is going to be the 11th Connecticut Infantry. And it's an approach to the bridge that's really kind of along the road on the northern side. And if you've ever seen that, it's a big open field. It's obvious that they're coming. And the Georgians actually open fire on them at a rather extended range and start taking a considerable number of casualties before they even reach the creek. Some of the 11th probably tried to cross the creek itself rather than go across the bridge. It's arguable whether any of the 11th actually made it onto the bridge. Some of them may have, but it seems like the assault was even really stopped before the bridge was even forced. And it's a brutally repulsive assault. But what it is doing is it's keeping the Georgians focused on what's going on in front of the bridge. And they're not paying attention to what's going on further south. They know that behind them, they've got that other ridge further back where there are some Confederate forces on that ridge, but they also know at that point that their rear is secure and their right is not threatened, or at least as far as they can tell. So they're focused on what's going on in this bridge, and they're maintaining that bridge as a vital tactical crossing point. About an hour and a half later, you're going to have the second assault on the bridge. And again, at this point, the Georgians are still focused on the bridge. Okay, Rodman, who is the officer that Burnside sends south, is trying to find this ford or crossing point again to get around on the Confederate right, and he's doing his best, presumably, to actually get there, but he doesn't have any real good information on the area. He understands there are fords down that way, but finding it and crossing it are a different story. So about 11:30, the 2nd Maryland and the 6th New Hampshire under James Nagle are going to approach from the southern side of the road and in column and approach the bridge to assault the bridge. Now, they approach again in full view of Toombs's men on the hillside. And Toombs's men keep up highly accurate fire on them all the way on the approach to the bridge. Again, this is an open space during the war. There's very little vegetation. And from the moment they kind of break what little cover they have on the approach to the bridge, they're under fire the entire way. And in column with 4 men abreast, if you miss one guy, as long as you're a reasonably competent marksman aiming in the general direction, you're probably going to hit somebody else. At least the odds are better than not that you will. So it's a pretty galling fire that's laid upon the 2nd Maryland and 6th New Hampshire on the approach. And they make it to the bridge and they start forcing the bridge. They get some way across. But again, they're repulsed. But what are they doing? They're keeping their focus on the bridge. And Rodman is encountering virtually no resistance further south. And he's finally getting to Snavely's Ford and crossing it and beginning to get his troops, they got about 1,500 men down there, to get across the river and around on the right of the Confederates. Now, the other thing, too, is that force that's down there is potentially going to block or at least encounter any of Lee's reinforcements that are coming up that day. And Lee, by this point, has had 2 batches of reinforcements arrive. Stonewall Jackson's men in the middle of the day, and the last batch is going to get the last group under A.P. Hill will actually arrive during the course of this, a little bit after the course of this battle at Burnside's Bridge, after Rodman's forced that forward further down. Now, the third assault is going to go in about 3 p.m. Now, the reality of the third assault is that things have changed pretty drastically by this point, because Rodman had crossed Snavely's Ford, and Rodman's men are now behind Toombs's men. And Toombs and his officers up on the hillside behind, immediately where the action is, can look behind them toward the rise about a mile away, where he knows there are Confederate troops. But the problem Toombs now has is that he has Burnside in front of him, and he now sees that he has Rodman behind him. So his position has now become virtually completely untenable. He only has probably about maybe between 250 and 300 men left at this point. They're probably suffered between 100 and 150 casualties or so during the course of the couple hours fighting, because the Georgians have been taking casualties. It's not exactly like the federal troops are going in with nothing up pipe and just storming with bayonets. That's not what they're doing. Now, the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania are going to make the third and final assault on the bridge. And one of the reasons this assault works, 2 reasons. Number one, because Toombs can now see he's rapidly losing control of the terrain. He understands that he's going to have a large Union force behind him fairly soon, and if he doesn't move, he's got a problem. The other reason this assault works better than the other 2 assaults, and the first assault was really not well organized, all the second one was somewhat better, but this one actually is better, is if you go behind Burnside's Bridge on the east side, on the low side, just immediately on the other side of the bridge, about 100 yards in, there's a big hill. And the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania are going to form up behind that hill. And again, from the crest of that hill to the bottom of the bridge is probably only about 150 yards or so. It's not very far. They form up behind the hill. And when they launch their attack, they rapidly come up over the hill and are basically on top of the bridge before the Georgians can really lay any effective fire down on them. And they don't have a lot of time to really affect the assault. And the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania end up carrying the bridge on the third assault. Now, the reason, again, is because Toombs is not going to hang around here much longer anyway, but the other part is this is a fairly well thought out assault, and it doesn't give Toombs's men much time to react. Now, there's a really interesting little story that goes along with this. The 51st, and there's some argument over whether this is anecdotal or not, but the analysis that I've read of it tends to suggest that it may have happened, probably happened. The 51st Pennsylvania had apparently been in trouble a few times with their brigade commander, a guy named Ferrero, who was a teetotaler, for being a little too fond of their whiskey. So Ferrero, not liking alcohol anyway, had taken away the 51st Pennsylvania's whiskey sometime in the past. The story goes that the 51st Pennsylvania asked Ferrero, if we take the bridge, will you give us our whiskey back? And Ferrero supposedly said yes. And then, of course, the rest of the story is the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania carry the bridge. And Ferrero is obligated at that point to return their whiskey to them, which they were very displeased, to say the least, that Ferrero had taken from them in the first place. It's actually one of the more interesting little anecdotes of the war, and it gives some color and contrast and a little bit of humor to another grim point, really, in the Antietam fight. Now, looking at Burnside's Bridge, let's really kind of be objective about what's going on during this. And because Burnside's really received a lot of heat over the course of years and a lot of criticism over the way he kind of handles this bridge attack. Burnside's mission evolved as the battle evolved. Now, Burnside's again, not an inexperienced general at this point. He knows this can possibly happen. It's not the issue, but what he goes there to do and what he ends up having to do are two totally different things. He ends up basically on a blocking mission or a flank security mission, and it turns out to be an assault. And again, can we blame Burnside for poor reconnaissance of the area? Well, yeah, to an extent you can. But again, he wasn't expecting to attack realistically first thing in the morning. He knew that that could obviously happen at any point, but it really wasn't what he was thinking he was going to have to do. As soon as Burnside realizes he has to attack, he tries to do the rational thing, which is to find some easier way across further down the river to get around on the Confederate right, roll the Confederate right up, and get through and up on the heights that way. He's not, Burnside is not an idiot. He's not really a bad commander, but he's trying to use time to save men. But part of what he ends up having to do is to kind of, dangle the carrot, so to speak, in front of Toombs's men to kind of keep them occupied there. And the various attacks on the bridge are allowing this flank attack to go in basically almost unhindered and cross Snavely's Ford once they find it and get up on the high ground and eventually get behind Toombs's men. So by the time we get to 3 p.m. with the third assault, Toombs realizes the game is basically up. Now, again, the Confederate remnants on Lee's right under Toombs, that whole area, and Toombs is pretty much the end of it until A.P. Hill's men start to arrive shortly after 3 o'clock. It becomes unhinged. So that gate kind of starts to swing open. But by the time that the bridge is crossed and the ford is crossed and Toombs is unhinged from his defensive position behind the bridge, and he starts to go back towards Sharpsburg. By that time, Hill has actually made it to the area from Harper's Ferry and is again kind of coming in from the south and beginning to reinforce that ridge as well. So, looking at this sort of objectively, does that mission of Ninth Corps work? And the answer is, well, yeah, it does. And when some of the criticism really that's been leveled at Burnside is kind of unfair. He acted on his orders the way he was told to. When he was told to attack, he attacked. He tried to find a better way around, and that took time. He didn't have perfect knowledge of the area, and honestly, when we look at any Civil War battlefield, or really any battlefield, nobody's ever going to have perfect knowledge, but Civil War battlefields are notorious for both sides really kind of flailing around trying to figure out what's going on and having generally poor information a lot of the time on what the lay of the land looks like and what the terrain looks like. And again, you're always playing for time. Does this mission succeed? Well, yeah, it does. Are the bridge assaults costly? Yes, they are. They end up costing about 600 men from Burnside's commander in the course of the day between dead and wounded. But it also diminishes Toombs' command seriously. Toombs has lost half or more of his men by the end of the day. And, it was a small brigade anyway. And a lot of these brigades that are Antietam, especially the more experienced brigades, are going to be smaller because, again, the number of troops has been whittled down. They've both been fighting at South Mountain. They'd been on active campaign before that, and a lot of these units had gotten smaller and smaller and smaller as a result. In the end, it's not a bad maneuver objectively, and it's not a bad attack, and the attack across Snavely's Ford is good. It just takes more time than would have been advisable. So between about 10 o'clock, you're looking at about 5 hours before all this develops favorably for Burnside and his men trying to cross up a pretty steep bank and try to carry a pretty difficult piece of terrain considering what's levied against them. I mean, again, it may be it's a plain fact that Toombs's men are armed with muzzle loaders, right? And the rate of fire, if you're lucky, is about 3 or 4 a minute. But still, the volume of fire they can put down on a rather narrow area is pretty tremendous. And the other thing that really is more condemning, honestly, in some ways, than the narrowness of the bridge, if you look at what happens during the course of the assaults, is the fact that they're really, the first and second assaults are just shot to pieces on the approach to the bridge because there's no good cover for them to utilize during the course of the attack. So looking at this objectively, what effect does it have on the course of the battle? Well, it starts to condense Lee's lines even further. Lee can't really hold, he has to pull men, Walker's men specifically, from this area of the field rather early in the battle by about 9 o'clock to reinforce his left to make sure that left flank doesn't collapse after all the pressure around the cornfield and West Woods. And now, obviously, the Sunken Lane. At the same time, some of the fighting's going on at Sunken Lane, Bloody Lane. You've got the fighting going on at beginning to occur at Burnside's Bridge. So the focus of the battle has started to move. But if you look at the course of the battle from about 5 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock when the battle really starts up at Burnside's Bridge, and then 5 hours after that at 3, when admittedly AP Hill arrives, but very late in the day, what's happening is this sort of extended line that Lee is on between over here in the cornfield and down here by Lower Bridge or Burnside's Bridge has been collapsing, condensing, and falling back towards Sharpsburg the entire time. So overall, although it's the number of casualties has been absolutely tremendous, especially earlier in the day, and this action in and of itself is rather expensive, it is successful, and it does force Lee back again and again and again. So again, kind of looking at this, with fresher eyes and some of the more recent analysis, what we really see is that this develops in not such a bad manner. Again, is it a costly attack? Well, sure it is, but he's going to fight uphill pretty much regardless of where he goes. And he's going to fight uphill without a whole lot of cover, and he's going to do his best. Burnside really does his best to try to minimize, the number of assaults he's going to have to make and the number of casualties he's going to have to make by crossing lower at another ford and then coming up the side. It just takes too much time. Here are a list of the sources, by the way, and some of them are similar. I've added a few in here as we go. So, questions?
Yeah, good presentation. I got one.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a count? Do we have any good estimate of casualties from the first assault versus the second assault versus the third assault?
The first assault, if with the 14th Connecticut, is going to cost about, it's a little over 100, I think it's a little over 150 men for the first assault. The second assault is actually a lot bloodier because of the amount of time they're under fire, and the bulk of the casualties for Burnside's Bridge are really going to occur during the second assault. You're going to have the numbers about 400 men for that second assault, and then the 100 or so odd casualties that occur. Part of that's with the third assault and some internecine fighting mixed in. So the first assault is only one regiment. It's really bloody. They lose over 100 men in the first assault, really don't even make it to the bridge. The second assault, when they're approaching from the south, the Maryland unit, the New Hampshire unit are approaching from the south in full view of Toombs's men on the hillside, is where the bulk of the casualties are going to occur. That's when they're actually getting onto the bridge after being under fire for a considerable amount of number of time, because there's no cover to the approaches of that bridge other than the cover that's finally made with the third assault, where the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania form up on the hill immediately behind the bridge on the east side and basically come over the hill at the double and make it to the bridge before Toombs's men really have a chance to even fire on them.
Is the Confederate fire just all musket fire, or is there any artillery supporting him?
At this point, it's pretty much all musket fire. There are some guns, but they aren't able. There are no Confederate guns really able to have any effect on this battle because if you look at, and it's easy to understand why there are guns behind Toombs, and there are guns to Toombs's left, and there are Confederate guns behind Toombs, on the basically the ridge outside of Sharpsburg. But you would have to bring the guns up to the basically the little cliff almost that looks down, the little draw that drops down in the creek to even fire down in the creek. Because anything behind that, you would have to have a way, you'd have to have basically like mortars or something to drop the fire in, and they don't have the ability to do that. I don't even know that Lee's army had any mortars with it at the time. The guns would have to be brought up right to the edge of the little cliff that overlooks the creek, and maybe you could have fired howitzers and dropped the rounds in there, but we're talking about indirect fire, which is really not something that was understood during the Civil War. The first real experiments with indirect fire take place during the Civil War, but it certainly was nothing that had been tinkered with by the time of Antietam.
So it's a pure musket versus target battle.
This is mostly a infantry versus infantry fight.
Okay. Other questions? I think Reed has got a couple of questions that he would like to ask.
Okay, go ahead.
You can unmute Reed. Reed. Okay, Reed's obviously distracted. He wrote 3 questions in the chat section. Question 1, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. I dread the thought of the place said that despite all rules of thumb that you don't have a river Potomac at your back. Lee did. The book says this is because Lee wanted his flanks protected, part and parcel of Lee being a risk taker. I gather what he is basically saying is, did Lee make a mistake by fighting with a river on his back? Which is a question I've also asked many times.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of looking at the end of the day in the battle as a whole. It's a tremendously risky proposition. But again, looking at Lee's writing before the battle, look at Lee's actions during the battle, and look at Lee's writing after the battle. Lee, when he gets back into Virginia, really kind of after the 18th, wants to turn around and go right back at it again. Lee has confidence in his army. And Lee, hangs in this fight all day long, by his fingernails sometimes, but he does. And, Lee is taking this chance, but Lee is confident that he can win. That really seems to be the overall impression. Lee has faith that he can win this battle, even though he knows he's outnumbered by McClellan. He doesn't seem to shirk away from the battle. If he didn't think he could win, the logical thing for him to do, what he presumably would have done, is cross back across the Potomac. But he hangs in outside of Sharpsburg, knowing the Army of Potomac is there, knowing his numbers are diminished, knowing that the bulk of his army, that half of his army has to catch up with him, and he's still confident he can win.
Okay, Reed's second question. Apparently he cannot unmute. Ever since our tour and compounded by the book, I'm intrigued by stragglers. You said that this is because of poor supply of food and the needing to forage, or they were exhausted on the forced marches. My question is really what was acceptable and what wasn't in terms of straggling.
Well,
when was it straggling and when was it desertion?
Well, okay. Straggling is when you fall off, basically when you fall out of the roadside, right? Or you can't keep up with the column, but you don't abandon the army, okay? Meaning you're not running off into the woods and never coming back. The simple answer is desertion is when you can't keep up with the column and you run off into the woods and you never come back. Lee's army is going to get about 6,000 men back after the battle, after all the stragglers are finally rounded up. So that's really the dividing line. Straggling is you're exhausted, you can't go on. Desertion is you just decide you don't want to go on, and you decide to permanently depart from the army. That's the pretty clean line there between those two.
Well, we've got a multi-part question here. Was this a CSA or a USA issue in particular?
Both armies suffer from stragglers. It's not that they don't. It happens actually throughout the war. It's certainly not isolated to this theater. It happens in the West too. Guys just, whether honestly, a lot of the time it comes down to exhaustion, but some of it's just laziness too from time to time. But most of it is due to the fact that men have been pushed further than they can really go and keep that speed up that the Army wants to maintain. So it's a constant problem for both armies, but Lee's army by Antietam is really beginning to suffer from it. And again, it seems to be with Lee's army that it's due to a combination of problems. But really what it comes down to, I think, looking at the evidence, is that those two problems significantly are, well, three really. Number one, they're underfed, if they're fed at all. And this is probably the worst supply situation Lee is going to be in until 65, maybe late 64. Number two, and we don't think about this a lot, but again, it goes into the equation, is, they're not very well supplied as far as other things go. So shoes, uniforms, that sort of thing. And that takes a toll. So all sorts of supplies are really basically short. And number three is, this has been a tremendously active campaign. And these guys, a lot of days, are going to march over 12 miles a day. And when you combine the poor state of equipment, especially for things like footwear, right? The poor state of nutrition, because if they are being fed, if you look at what, some of the comments that happened around the time of Antietam, is a lot of Lee's army, to the extent that it had food, was nothing but dried corn. I mean, some brigades report having, meat of some sort, but a lot of them are existing on dried corn. So more or less what they're doing, and, not having any fat to mix with it, which is kind of when the soldiers had salt pork or salted beef or something like that, a lot of times what they would do is cook the meat in the pan and then mix the cornmeal in, or grind the dry corn up, make cornmeal out of it, mix that in with the grease. Sometimes they'd actually wrap it around the rammers and then, bake it over the fire. So they're at least getting the protein and the fat out of the meat and then combining that with corn and then, getting something out of it. Corn really has almost zero nutritional value to it. Part of the reason that the soldiers at Andersonville in Georgia, they're starved to death. They don't have much, but what little they do have is corn and, cornmeal, and it's just not something you can live on. So, you're creating all sorts of problems by not supplying the army, and then you're expecting them to keep up a pace, which is maybe not totally unreasonable for men in their prime who are well fed, well shod, well hydrated, and cared for. But under these conditions, even relatively young men will have serious problems after a few days.
Okay, the third question seems to be three different subjects. Who had the idea to do the third assault?
The third assault on the bridge was also, Burnside's doing, and it's just the approach was better. The first assault by the 14th Connecticut was really improvised. It was kind of on the spot, go try to take the bridge, get across the bridge, and clear those rebels off the heights, sort of thing. And it got shot to pieces. The second assault by the Maryland and New Hampshire, 2nd Maryland, 14th New Hampshire, I think it was better organized, but again, really, in an open field of fire. The third assault was better considered. And basically, it's like, well, gee, there's that, we've got that area to cut. We've got that little beautiful little piece of cover right back there. Let's form up on the other side of that and then rush the bridge really quickly and carry the bridge before they can really lay too much fire down on us. But again, Burnside had just moved in this area in the morning, and it's getting used to what's in the area. And by the time the third assault really launches at 3 o'clock, they're more able to understand the lay of the terrain and come up with a better plan. Burnside doesn't want them. The intent seems to be Burnside doesn't really want them leaving that bridge. He wants to get across the bridge to get up and carry the heights, yes, but he's also attacking the bridge to keep them there and distracted so he can get around on their right and roll that flank up.
His last question, and this is going to be a tough one to discuss. Was there any form of SOPs or lessons learned in Civil War battles?
Well, okay. I'm going to try to answer this in modern terms. If you look at it through the 1860s terms, yes, regiments are learning when they fight. Does that translate directly into modern SOPs? No, it doesn't. Lessons learned at the higher level, really normally beyond the regiment, I would say, at least at the division corps level, are typically written up as what we would call an after action report and then submitted up the chain of command. From the regimental level up, we know this was done on both sides. Now, this is done to create an account, really. But what you don't have, you don't really have a professional military sort of analytical body that is compiling these as you go and then turning these back into something like circulars or memorandums that really go back to the Army. That's not happening, and that's the big difference between World War I and World War II, and even relatively chronologically kind of close war with the Civil War. That level of process and that level of analysis and the idea to take this stuff and kind of chew it and digest it and turn it around in something like a short amount of time, that's not going to happen yet. Again, do the regiments learn? Do the soldiers learn? Sure they do, but it's not really digested and then regurgitated and disseminated that way. Not like it is later on.
Okay, Jim Dingman has his hand up.
All right, one thing I'm struck with when I read Hartwig was the ammo issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because he keeps on stressing throughout this fight how, for example, the guys who were pissed off about the booze,
Mm-hmm.
they were very short on ammo when they got across the stream.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered what you thought about that, because it raised all sorts of interesting questions about how do you get ammunition in these Civil War battles to troops,
Mm-hmm.
because that seems to be an interesting problem. And then, of course, AP Hill's division comes up, or Hill's division comes up,
Mm-hmm.
and they counterattack later in the afternoon,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess they're all loaded up for bear. But that's an interesting question. I was wondering what you thought about that. That just practical question, and because one point he says 20,000 rounds were fired by one regiment against the Confederates, and they didn't really do much damage to them at all. So I'm just wondering about that whole question about getting ammo to troops in these battles. What your thoughts are about that?
Well, I'm going to approach it from two different points of view. Number one, let's look at the Army of the Potomac. Number two, let's look at the Army of Northern Virginia. So one of the big main supply depots for the Union Army during the war was Washington, D.C. And there is a famous picture, and I'll see if I can find it for one of their later presentations, of a literal mountain of boxes of hardtack outside of DC at an Army depot. So the Army of the Potomac is going to find it most points in the war relatively easy to resupply. Antietam is not far from DC. The wagon trains and the supply trains that would have run from Washington to McClellan's army were not being really interfered with at the time. So the flow of supplies is easier for the Army of the Potomac. That being said, they just fought a battle 2 days before and expended a large amount of ammunition fighting at South Mountain. When they get to Antietam, McClellan has enough ammunition for the fight, but by the end of the day, McClellan is almost out of ammunition, especially artillery ammunition. If you look at the logistics system, it was possible, and indeed it happens during the course of most battles, that ammunition is brought out from trains to the regiments to resupply during the middle of the battle. This happens on both sides. Lee's army is in a very different situation. Lee's supply trains are extremely long. They run, realistically speaking, all the way from Richmond to his army to the extent that they can really get through. And Lee's supply of ammunition comes from various sources, and sometimes they're more reliable than others. And the quality of ammunition that the Confederate Army has is also highly variable in quality a lot of time during the course of the war. So it's not that, and you got to think about it this way. Most Union soldiers are probably going to, and most Confederate soldiers ideally are going to go into battle with at least 60 rounds of ammunition, probably. Okay. And you figure that, let's say a regiment's down to like 500 men, arguably, right? And every time they fire as a regiment, that's 500 rounds. They fire, 30 rounds apiece, that's 15,000 rounds of ammunition, right? They fire 60 rounds apiece, that's 30,000 rounds of ammunition. That's 30 cases of ammunition. Ammunition generally came in cases of 1,000. That's just an average, that's a pretty good fight, and that's not, if you think about it, that's not a really extended firefight either. Because you're thinking, let's say 3 rounds a minute sustained. And yeah, you're going to lose casualties along the way. Okay. But let's say 500 men keep up 3 rounds a minute, for 10 minutes. Well, there's 15, just do the math on that. And as you get in these longer engagements where, especially at Antietam at certain places, that there's going to be hours that they're going to be shooting at each other. The ammunition consumption, especially, small arms ammunition, becomes an issue. I'm thinking back at Bloody Lane, where, you've got those waves of Union assaults that come in, and as the assaults kind of fail or kind of wither in front of the line, what happens is a lot of those Federal troops lie down from, not perfect concealment, but at least somewhat obscure positions and start firing back. So, and all the fire is not going to be accurate. Actually, one of the things that you kind of see, or you kind of look at, you see accounts of during the American Civil War, really in wars after that, is firing is also kind of cathartic. So shooting is kind of therapeutic in a way. It gives you something to do and something to focus on, and it gives you something mechanical. So you're thinking more about the action than you are about what's going on around you. So is supplying a problem? Yeah, but the other thing is too is you have to understand that a regiment with a good number of men in it, let's say 300 or 400 or 500, even though a regiment's supposed to be about 1,000 men, they can consume an excessive amount of ammunition in a relatively short amount of time. And looking at the infantry numbers, trying to just do this basically, man, if you've got, let's say 1,500 men or 2,000 men, involved in a firefight every minute, let's say you've got 2,000 men fighting every minute, you're looking at 60,000 rounds of ammunition or 6,000 rounds of ammunition being expended a minute with 2,000 men at 3 rounds a minute. That's a lot of ammo. We don't think about that being a lot of ammunition in 2025, especially with semi-automatic, full automatic weapons. But with muzzle loading weapons, that's a considerable amount of ammo, and all of that has to be brought up with a much less inefficient or a much less efficient, I'm sorry, system of manufacturing and delivering that we have now. And ammunition resupply is slower. It has to be brought up either by hand or by wagon. And then most of the time when the fights are ongoing, the ammunition is kept back at a distance, whether it's artillery ammunition, whether it's infantry ammunition. And with artillery ammunition, what happens a lot of time is the batteries are sent back, the battery horses are sent back with the case on to retrieve ammunition at stores in the back where it's less likely to get hit or damaged, and then brought forward. And you're seeing a lot of that happen with the infantry ammunition as well, where they have to go back and get the ammunition and bring it up. So again, it's a problem that, I think a part of the reason that it's a little bit difficult for us to kind of wrap our minds around is we tend to think in ammunition consumption with automatic weapons, but realistically, again, when you've got 2,000 or 3,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 men firing at each other, that's a lot of ammunition being consumed minute by minute. And even with a well-supplied army, without the Army of the Potomac, which really doesn't have many supply problems for the most part during the war, you can consume a considerable store of ammunition in a day. And that's really what happens to Antietam. The Army of the Potomac goes into Antietam with a good supply of ammunition, but by the end of the day, it's exhausted almost all of it.
Yeah, well, the thing that Reed's question raises when he talks about SOP,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about how the First Corps on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg performs tactically down a regimental level.
Right.
And it's clear that you have veteran troops who've learned their lesson the hard way, and they're able to, as we all know, at least in the initial fighting before Ewell's Corps comes in there, they're able to tactically maneuver in regimental form and do a very good job in stopping the Confederate attack. And that kind of thing you see throughout the Civil War.
Mm.
And it's always been interesting to me. I mean, how did that the learning process of all that came from fighting, and people, absorbing the lessons, which is something we don't necessarily get in sort of the kind of detail from a modern sense we'd like to perhaps know, but is obviously what went on.
Yeah, and the other thing too that I think is really important to understand by Antietam in the East, and then you see it throughout the rest of the war, especially these more experienced units, is the units move better.
Right.
They're really able to respond faster. And for instance, these men who have been on campaign a considerable amount of time, when their officers put them into formation in Antietam, or let's say, around Culp's Hill at Gettysburg, the officers have a better eye for the land due to experience, and then the men themselves are going to find a better position to put themselves in when they're put there. So, yeah, I mean, you do have that learning, you do have that on the job experience, but as far as digesting it in some sort of an organized form and then returning that information to the units, which is what I really am thinking about when I'm looking at lessons learned in SOPs in a modern sense. You're not really, there's no real intellectual mechanism for that at the time.
Mm. Mm.
Now, again, not that it's not learned on the field, but it's not really being disseminated the way that we would do it today, or even the way we did it in World War II.
Right.
That's the big difference.
Right. I just interviewed an Israeli author on October 7th. And my big hammering of him was I said, look, you come from a military culture that was affected by the Agronaut Commission and all the lessons learned from that. And how did you, after 50 years, because I would go listen to people talk about the lessons of this, lessons, how, we can't overestimate the enemy and all that kind of crap.
Mhm.
And then you have a situation that repeats itself in a very unpleasant way.
Mhm.
So it's always interesting to me how armies, how militaries either screw it up completely or don't know how to institutionalize lessons learned in a interesting and creative way. Anyway.
And I think it's a really interesting point, Jim, and not to go too far off topic, but and with the Israelis in '73, exactly the same thing happens on a much bigger scale. But
Oh, hell yeah.
uh, does the Army do that after the Civil War? I think that's a really interesting kind of an extrapolation of this question, and you know, because they don't have another major conflict until World War, well, the Spanish-American War, really, I guess. You could call it a major conflict, but I kind of grapple with calling it a major conflict. Until World War One, the answer is, well, too much time has passed. The information's changed, the battlefield's changed, the technology's changed, all of that stuff. But one of the things I think the way we could kind of make the argument though that they try to do that, especially individually, is that a lot of memoirs and a lot of unit histories are written after the war that really do go into detail um, about the battles and what's going on and what they thought during the battle. And a lot of these guys corresponded with each other extensively in the 1870s and 1880s, even in the 1890s, about specific points and specific battles during the war. Hey, do you remember the 17th of
Mhm.
September? And when we're holding Buddy Lane, do you recall X, Y, and Z happening, toward the end of the fight, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's kind of their way of doing it on their own. But again, and I think it's, institutionally, it's incredibly valuable. But as far as that organized system, it's just not something we really see. But I agree with you. Really looking at lessons learned is, especially when it's done in an organized fashion after the battle, after the war, is fascinating. And really looking at the way that armies do that is fascinating. One of the things that I've read recently about the way that Americans tend to approach lessons learned is one of the things, a criticism is that Americans tend to look at just the things they screwed up instead of the things they did right. And there's this emphasis in the American military sometimes to put more emphasis on what not to do than what to do.
Mm.
That we're more cognizant of the things that we messed up than the things that we did well. Now, if that's just some sort of weird, masochistic, self-deprecating facet of our society, I don't know. But it's one of those other little quirks that makes you want to learn more about the culture that creates the analysis and why they structure it the way they do, I think.
Yeah, I know OCMH did a conference at the end of the Vietnam War,
Mm.
which was just on that question of how armies either assimilate defeat or don't assimilate defeat. It's held down for all I know, hell, Chris, you might have been there, but it was in early 70s in Washington. And, when you talk about the lessons of the Civil War, the only really good history I can think was Bigelow's book on Chancellorsville. I
Hmm.
mean, I always found that to be the best book written about a Civil War campaign in the 19th century. And then Battles of Leaders, you sort of have to take with a grain of salt. It has some good stuff in it. Obviously, it wasn't Sherman. Didn't Sherman? Who went to Sedan? Was that Sherman? Sherman was Sedan, right?
Yeah.
In 1870.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they're learning from the European wars, and of course, breech loading weapons change everything.
Yeah.
Because 1866, by 1866, they're equipped with breech loaders. So, but yeah, it's an interesting question. How did we look at the wars going on in the late 19th century and absorb lessons? I would say we basically took our lessons from the Prussians, but dropped the French and shipped it to the Prussians.
Well,
But anyway, interesting question.
yeah, and Boy, that's when do we
Well,
slip away from Germany and when do we go to Clausewitz? Yeah, that's a
Oh hell, that's not
you
till
know,
Vietnam, man. That's like
so,
uh, let me comment a little bit on lessons learned for a moment.
okay.
My father went to work at the Concepts Analysis Agency in 1972 when it first opened, and I was in high school at the time, so he used to come home and tell me all the stories. And they literally were starting with nearly a blank sheet of paper. They had a combat model they got from Korg, which had been around since 1965. They had material from ORO and RAC, but they had fired ORO, they had fired RAC. They had a problem with an independent civilian contractor, which is why they set up this concepts analysis agency. And so I remember my father coming home with you know, they had an existing combat model that had already been around for a half a dozen years. So my father coming home and telling me horror stories with the combat model, and of course he had combat experience. And then he would come home with like a single sheet of paper showing advance rates over time, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
Mongols did 60 miles a day and other people did 10 miles a day and things like this. But it was all very basic stuff.
Mm,
Fundamentally, the core analytical document in the U.S. Army was the Maneuver Control Manual that was put out, that was maintained, I think, by Leavenworth back in the 1960s, being used for Leavenworth's war games. And the Center for Army Lessons Learned was not established until 1985.
yeah.
And I do know for a fact, because I've written about it, as has the Center for Military History, that we decided to learn no lessons from Vietnam. We basically left Vietnam and we said, that's it. We're not going to be in those wars anymore. Don't talk about it. Don't discuss it. Don't analyze it,
Yeah.
etc. When I first started doing the casualty estimate for Iraq for Center for Army Analysis, which is CAA also, same organization, just changed time. I at one point asked one of the people there, out of their 140 people, who was the counterinsurgency expert. And the
Yeah,
answer in 2004 was, we don't have one.
Oh yeah. Well, look, I remember. I don't know if you guys ever met Austin Long down there. You guys come, maybe Bill did. But Bill, you were working at DIA, right?
I was at that point I was at CIA.
Oh, you work in CIA. Okay, so
I,
Austin.
I was at DIA earlier.
All right, Austin was going back and forth to Afghanistan, and he wanted to set up a VC motivation and morale project similar to what they did during the Vietnam War. They weren't interested in that.
Hmm.
And I said, like, what kind of stupid shit is that? Really, I mean, that's like stupid shit. And, they weren't doing that. And like, he was making a big deal about it. He was he was at that point he was working for the CIA. And it just always blew my mind. And then of course they're discovering like Guerre Revolutionnaire, they're doing their counterinsurgency stuff. And I remember what's his name at West Point, um, who was the big enfant terrible about all that stuff. Uh, I forget his name. He was a brigade commander, and he was saying he was just tearing him a new asshole intellectually, really. And it's like they had forgotten everything, forgotten every goddamn thing. And then I'll give it to the Marine Corps at least. They were trying to do a good job there down in the areas they controlled, particularly after the first run, after the invasion. But it was still like it was mind-boggling to see how we had learned little to nothing from that whole conflict, that whole experience. As far as I'm concerned, we still haven't learned.
After Vietnam, after we left, the Army did a bunch of monographs on different aspects of the war, and it was very triumphalistic
Oh
because
yeah.
we had won. And the Army promptly forgot all about this when Saigon fell and never wanted to talk about it again, because we'll never do another counterinsurgency campaign, right? And in 2003, uh, late, probably December, uh, I and two of my colleagues got tasked to do a study of how the Army can secure their people moving on the main supply routes. And the other two guys uh, focused on technical solutions. I went into the tactical part. And what I did was I pulled out one of those monographs from Vietnam and started citing back to the Army what they had learned. And they were really appreciative. They were amazed at what we came up with. And, it was just the Army had forgotten, and I was reminding them of what they had learned after Vietnam. So, yeah,
Those
that's,
those are the Vietnam studies series you're talking about.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that was sort of a little half-assed to start with. Those studies, they were
Yeah,
sort
it
of
wasn't very deep.
they weren't very detailed. Even the stuff they did with the ARVN generals, which
Mhm,
had some good stuff. They translated the French official history. The French after action report
mhm,
of the first Indochina War was given to Marine Corps officers during the Vietnam War. And I remember a friend of mine grabbed it at Quantico and showed it to me. It was a non-classified document.
mhm.
And I said, "Oh, look, at least they're trying to understand that." But it's like, it's just I don't get me started.
Yeah,
Don't get me started. I start to get pissed off. I was going to go to a conference on Vietnam at Harvard, and I said, "Ah, the hell with it. Why go up there and get agitated?" Yeah. But anyway, yeah, the Civil War is interesting. I'm reading all about the Indian War right now, the Indian War. So I'm sort of like, my brain is like, oh, well, they have the breech loaders, they win the wagon box fight, and then they just equip themselves with the ability to shoot 10 rounds a minute, which, changes everything. But yeah, the tactical stuff, there are dissertations about this, about the impact of the French army in the post-Civil War period and the Prussian army. But it's an interesting question. How do we absorb doctrine? How do we learn from others?
mhm.
All that kind of stuff. Very interesting stuff.
Jim, you need to come out here and let's do a road trip to Fort Phil Kearny.
Oh yeah, that'd be cool, man. That'd be cool, Jad. I'd get a kick out of that. I haven't been out to the Little Bighorn battlefield in years. That's always fun to do. Anyway, well, thank you, Jamie. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Well,
Excellent, James.
got any more questions? We went pretty far afield this time.
I have one question, Jamie,
Mhm.
and excellent presentation. The question really is, what is controlling the tempo of the attacks on at Burnside Bridge? Is it a matter of as soon as the regiments are available in the assault position, getting to the assault position and moving them forward? Is it a deliberate delay? Is it a orders process? What's actually driving? Are there troops available for the attacks that Burnside's just kind of taking time to? I think this is what a 5 hour period where
Yeah.
he does three attacks over really whenever your start point is that you want to start with, and it seems like what's driving that tempo where it could have been faster, or was that as fast as it could have been?
Well, I think there's a couple factors here. Number one, the very first assault by the Connecticut troops is just what he could grab at hand to throw at the bridge at the time to see if you can carry it, right? So, let's see if we can see if we can rush the bridge and get that over with and get that done. McClellan sends messengers, I think it's 3 or 4 times to Burnside to get him to pressure Lee's right to keep the pressure up there, basically, really, so Lee can't keep reinforcing his left with troops from his right. So Burnside really sees his mission as to glue those troops down. And what he wants to do again is he really doesn't want to have to he wants to find an easier way around, and what he's trying to do with that one detachment is get around to the right and get around to the right flank of the Confederate troops, so he doesn't have to fight literally uphill. But part of the problem is, again, he doesn't have a very good idea of the area, so he's going to have to figure out what's there and then really build the attack after that. Now, and again, I think I alluded to this during the course of the little conversation, is that when he's conducting those assaults on the bridge with the troops at hand, he's trying to keep them there, which is basically to the spirit and letter, really, of his orders. But he also wants to find a way to do more than just pin those troops down, Toombs's troops down on the other side of the bridge, but actually, conduct a successful attack and actually start to move those people back. And honestly, it's a better execution of his order if not only can he keep Lee from reinforcing his left with his right, but actually if he can actually destroy or start to hammer Lee's right before those troops can arrive, before more troops can arrive from the Harper's Ferry area. So honestly, I really think if you're going to critique Burnside with some of the better new information and some of the better analysis of it, he does a pretty good job. And again, I think we expect things to move faster than they did. And if you look at the course of the Civil War and the course of a lot of average Civil War battles, they don't move with the speed that we often expect them to. And, for instance, look at the cornfield and Dunker Church and West Woods, you're looking at 4.5 hours, 5 hours really a battle there before that really starts to settle down. And by the time that starts to settle down, everything is starting to heat up around Sunken Lane. And by the time the battle at Sunken Lane starts to reach a pitch, then the battle at Burnside's Bridge starts to heat up. So I think part of our problem is we expect, or maybe we want to see these things develop faster than they do. There are no radios. It's not like communication is particularly fast. You've got semaphore flags, but most orders are still being conveyed via courier. So a lot of this is what you're seeing around Burnside's Bridge is A, trying to figure out the lay of the land, B, trying to figure out where the enemy is, and C, trying to find a way to fix the enemy in front of you so he can't reinforce other areas of the battlefield, but also find a way to successfully engage the enemy at a lesser cost to yourself and possibly destroy his position. And that takes 5 hours, considering all the factors, which is he really doesn't have a really good view of the area. The reconnaissance hasn't been great before us all starts. But again, kind of in Burnside's defense, he had just gotten there in a lot of ways. So, he's trying to understand the land and develop the situation as he goes. And by Civil War standards and considering the conditions at the time, that 5 hours may seem like a really long time, but with the circumstances at hand, it's fairly quick. I wouldn't call it super fast. But it's developed as fast as it reasonably can be, considering the conditions.
Would Burnside have been better served to have just threatened to attack and not actually do the attacks?
I don't think so, because if you look at,
I was going to ask, is there any evidence he was demonstrating or feinting?
Well, no, and I think the reason being is because look at the terrain. Those are vast open fields of fire around that bridge during the war. And if there is no obvious threat, meaning there aren't troops in front of Toombs's men and on that flank holding them down, because Lee had already reinforced his left from that side before 9 o'clock, which is really what gets McClellan to order Burnside to start carrying that area, because Burnside being in that area prior to 9 o'clock didn't stop Lee from pulling troops from that area to reinforce his left. So if the argument, I think, then has to be, if that's not stopping Lee from pulling troops from his right to reinforce his left, the only reasonable way to get Lee to do it is to pressure the troops on his right so he can't afford to pull them away and reinforce the left.
Yeah, let me just add to that. Ben, I don't know if you have any problems about going into pirate websites to get books for free. But there's Anna's Archive. They have a very good atlas on the Battle of Antietam done by Gottfried. And what it shows is the tactical situation. You'd have to download it. It's the best pirate website in the world at this point. They've knocked out Libsyn, the bastards. But anyway, they have Hartwood's book, and they also have this atlas. And what you'll see is that these two regiments, they're supported by two batteries. They're getting frontally assaulted by regiments, or two regiments at a time. And so 400 guys in light entrenchments with the kind of, 100, 150 yards, they can just keep shooting at these guys, and they do. They stop them. They just, they hit the heads of the column. The two batteries have plunging fire. They just stop them. And eventually, of course, as was just mentioned, the whole division is trying to outflank them. Rodman's trying to outflank them. But it's a really interesting, crazy situation to look at. And because I always say, why the hell don't they simultaneously attack? But anyway, because if you do that in a war game, you always crush the Confederates. But that's not what happened, of course.
Yeah, and in a war game, you've got a perfect bird's eye view
Perfect
of the battle,
intelligence. Yeah, exactly,
and you
exactly,
know where everything is. And in this
exactly.
one, they just don't.
Yeah, exactly.
Chip.
Yeah. Jamie, I had gone to the Gallipoli battlefield in when was that? 2000. And later, when I went to Antietam with my war college class, that was in 2010, I think. And I really got a sense of just the Gallipoli, the tennis court. If you're familiar with that battle,
Mm-hmm.
where the Anzac troops were trying to cross this little piece of land, and the Turks were in terraced trenches in front of them. And when we did Burnside Bridge, I looked across there and I thought, my goodness, this is almost the same battle, because the Confederate troops were practically in terraced trenches, looking down on this little bridge they were trying to force, and it really echoed in my mind. Now I might not be remembering Burnside's bridge as well as all that, but the two similarities, it was just amazing. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the defensive position at Burnside's Bridge, and then from my knowledge of the Gallipoli battlefield, I actually worked in Turkey for a couple of years, but I never made it to Gallipoli. You're looking at a similar situation where you've got an open area below the hill or the escarpment or whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
that provides a virtually unobstructed view of all the troops down in that area.
Right.
And the ability, and the ability to bring fire down in that area, from virtually any point surrounding it is tremendous. So you can't, and again, the dimensions are a lot different, but the
Yeah.
setup is very much the same, right? And you've got to find a way to move quickly if you're going to move at all in order to survive, or at least to minimize the chances of casualties. And it's a perfect defensive position. And if you really had the ability to put more men in there with Toombs, or if Toombs had, I mean, arguably, let's just say if Toombs had actually had twice the number of men, that may not have been a position that would have been carried under any circumstances. And arguably, Toombs held out there until he is outflanked, until Toombs sees men behind him. He holds on to that hillside. Now, he loses men the whole time, but it's that third assault. Yeah, it carries the bridge, but it really carries the bridge in combination with the fact that Toombs has just been outflanked, his right's been rolled up, and if he doesn't get out of the position he's in, he's going to get gobbled up. So, is it a absolutely unassailable position? Well, maybe not, but is it a really tough nut to crack? Yeah, and without bringing a lot more fire to bear on Toombs's men, who are probably about 1/7 or so of the size of the men brought against Toombs over the course of the day. There's no way to get him out of there. And I think during the course of there are probably multiple times during the course of history we can look at. That the situation is similar. You bring a ridiculous number of men to the battlefield, and it still won't carry it because the position is just so good. I think, honestly, to an extent, different situation, different terrain, but somewhat similar is Culp's Hill. It's the same thing at Gettysburg. I mean, you will throws his men at Culp's Hill finally, but there's just they can't get up that hill. It's just you look back on it, and it really seems like it's that third assault and the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania that carry that. But honestly, it's really probably the fact that Toombs realized he has to leave,
Right.
and not the fact that the Pennsylvanians got their whiskey back. I don't really think so.
I think the whiskey was probably important.
It was. I'm quite certain it was a motivator. But
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Well, Jamie, good presentation. We will see you in 2 weeks.
all right, very good.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank
Take
you.
care.